Hello, it's another episode of the Gaming Memories Podcast, where I, the gaming prophet, he who hath been commissioned by the gaming gods to bring back the one true video game podcast simply by interviewing creative and interesting people about their favorite gaming memories growing up. And I'm not gonna do what the gods told me today because, like most prophets, I'm kind of a hypocrite. But that's the name of the game. Today we're doing Generations Part 2. A quick little recap. Generations Part 1, I brought on Chris from Retrohangover and Bill from the Gaming and Collecting Podcast to go through the abridged Reader Digest version history of consoles. And we worked our way all the way up to essentially the beginning of the 16-bit era. And today we're going to go through the 16-bit era kind of to the beginning of the 32-bit era. So I have Chris from Retrohangover on again and Bill from Gaming and Collecting Podcast. Links to those podcasts will be in the podcast description for your convenience. Please check them out. Both of those podcasts are much more consistent and professional than mine, but there's only one me, so I'm irreplaceable, baby. But that's pretty much it. They talk me through a bunch of shit that I didn't know, and I'm assuming that you, the listener, will not know most of it as well. I'm very into video games, and these guys make me look like a brand new white belt on the mats. Like I've never known anything about video games in my entire life. These two dudes are the real deal. Shout out to Ashton Ruby for editing this episode. This one was a doozy for him. He also edits for Retrohangover and the King of Games, which just came out. Also, King of Games. I think it's out now or it's almost out. It's on Patreon. By the time this episode actually is public to you guys, I'm pretty sure King of Games will be out. And that's where Retrohangover invited between like 6 to 8 different podcasts. And we went through all the different games of 1992 and had these big discussions and ultimately decided what is the best game that came out that year. All I'm going to say is they're all fucking wrong and I was right. But you guys should know that. I'm the prophet. But no, like every prophet, nobody listens to me. That's how it's been since the dawn of religion. I guess all these dudes are going to burn in gaming hell. Either way, it's an awesome series. Shout out to Retrohangover for putting it together. I was on a handful of episodes. I had a blast. Excuse me. I'm recovering from the COVID-19. After 3 years, I finally got COVID-19. I didn't die. No, some of you are probably disappointed that I'm not deceased. But unfortunately, even though the White House said that because I'm an unvaccinated swine and I'm stupid and that it was going to be the winter of death and destruction for me, I am like a cockroach or those water bears, the microscopic insect things that can survive in space. I just don't die. But I have some leftover chest congestion. I don't even know where I'm going with this now. Oh yeah, I'm supposed to talk about what I've been up to recently with the podcast and gaming. I finally, after 2 years of recording it, uploaded my Final Fantasy VIII video of all the bosses with all the best mods in 4K, interpolated using AI to get it to 60 FPS, because at the time when I went through all the demastered mods, so you have Final Fantasy VIII remastered on PC, then you have the McDindus mods and the demastered mods, which is ironic they call it demastered, but it basically updates all the textures, runs all the backgrounds through AI upscales, a bunch of gameplay tweaks, audio tweaks, music tweaks. I put all those mods together. I went through and played the entire game, captured footage of all the bosses, because at the time there was no proper 60 FPS mod, and I don't think there is yet, but I know people are working on it for Final Fantasy VIII. Because most of the old PlayStation 1 games, including Final Fantasy VIII and Final Fantasy IX and Final Fantasy VII, the game logic was tied to frames. So if you make something 60 frames a second, it either speeds the game up or breaks logic, breaks collision detection, all those things. So in order to get an idea of what Final Fantasy VIII would look like as a proper remaster in 4K 60 FPS, I had to capture all the footage and then run it through a program called Flow Frames, which is an AI machine learning algorithm that looks at video and learns how to interpolate and inject frames. And it does a really, really good job. Some warping, some stuff, but it took me so long to go through and interpolate all of those boss fights and then put it all together. Ended up being like an hour plus as one video for all the boss fights, and then uploading it took like 4 days because my upload speed is atrocious, but it is up. It's finally up. And as we speak, I have done that with Final Fantasy VII. Luckily, Final Fantasy VII does have a proper 60 FPS mod, and so does Final Fantasy IX. I've gone through all 3 games. I've captured all the boss fights. I've I've captured all the summons, all the spells. I'll be doing retro respective reviews on them and more just videos where I'm not even in the video. It's just showing the boss fights. It's just showing the spells, showing the scenery, showing the mods, those type of things. So I am finally, after 2 years of talking about it, taking the YouTube channel seriously. Please check it out. Gaming Memories podcast on YouTube. The Final Fantasy VIII video is up. The Final Fantasy VII one right now is at 99% uploading. Still has an hour and a half left. Why? A little sneak peek to some upcoming episodes where I'll be talking about the 3 Final Fantasies on PS1 because I recently played through all 3 of them. The boss fights for Final Fantasy VII all together, edited super tight, ended up being 2 hours. The boss fights for 8 and 9 both clocked in just under an hour. That gives you an idea of how much content is in Final Fantasy VII versus Final Fantasy VIII and 9. It's weird because Final Fantasy VII was the first one and you think it would be smaller scale, and it is smaller scale in raw storage size. It has less FMVs, the music takes up less space, but actual content to play, I was surprised in hindsight after playing all 3 in a row. I played 7 last. It's got more stuff. It's got more bosses. It's got more mini games. It's just got more stuff in it. So that is about uploaded, but that is a whopping 2 hours and 20 minutes. Now, I will say, if you took out Emerald Weapon and Ruby Weapon, which are the 2 super bosses in Final Fantasy VII, those were 20 minutes each. So if you took those 2 bosses out, it would be an hour versus like an hour 25, hour and a half. So it's not quite double the amount of content simply because those 2 boss fights just take so long. Even when you're level 99 with maxed out fucking everything. I never beat those bosses as a kid, and I really wanted to beat those bosses now as an adult. And even with maxed out everything, following a strategy guide, looking at all the different ways people have beat these bosses, it still was so goddamn frustrating. But I did it. And that will be, by the time this is out, that video will be uploaded. So also check out my Final Fantasy VII all bosses video. Again, pristine 4K 60 FPS quality. I was beyond anal when it comes to my recording quality and my compression quality when I edited it and exported it out of Premiere. YouTube, unfortunately, has kind of a shitty compression algorithm, but there are tricks to lessen that. So I have gone to great lengths to give you a YouTube video that's pretty close to what I experienced playing the game in native 4K 60 FPS on my monster rig. All for you. If you don't want to spend 2 days modding Final Fantasy VII and troubleshooting and getting all these different mods to work, and then spend 30 hours playing through the game, and you just want to see what all this cool stuff looks like with instant gratification, my YouTube channel has got you covered, motherfuckers. Other than that, give it up for Chris at Retrohangover, Bill from the Gaming and Collecting Podcast, Generations Part 2, they lead me through the history of consoles, and Part 3, we will finish it off. Until then, I say these things in the name of Miyamoto the Father, Kojima the Son, and Harmac the Holy Ghost. Amen, and enjoy the show. We are here. It is working. So it took me like 3 months to get you guys scheduled again. Thanks for your patience.
No problem. What are we talking about again?
We're talking obscure gaming history.
Well, we were doing the history of gaming. I think we ended off on Super Nintendo, like Genesis and TurboGrafx, like Gen 4.
I mean, that's what I thought too.
Well, I remember because we were like getting there and then like...
It was 3 hours and you didn't know what we were doing.
Gen 5 is like where shit starts to get really insane. So I think we kind of stopped it there because it was going to be a freaking 10-hour podcast at that point.
Well, I think the pace is going to actually pick up since Gen 5.
This is the gen where I was actually alive. So
oh, yeah, that's true. I was actually cognizant, not just alive.
Yeah.
What was your first thing? Was a handheld, right, Bill? If I remember correctly.
First was the Game Boy Color, but we had a family PlayStation. I
do like that you enjoy the PlayStations in your collection. You post good shit. I started playing Panzer Dragoon Saga. Is that the third one on
the third?
So, that's the most expensive game I own.
Yeah.
Yep. Same. The second most expensive game I own.
Oh, what's your most expensive?
Crusader of Senti.
Oh, that's up there.
Total fluke how I got it too. I have no business having that game.
Oh, really?
None. No. I got it for $7 and I didn't even know what I was buying. Yeah.
Jesus.
What game is it again? Crusader?
It's the Genesis is Zelda, kind of.
Yep.
I thought that was Beyond Oasis or something like that. Something
Beyond
that's like Streets of Zelda.
Streets of Zelda.
Yes.
What's this one called?
Legend of Rage. Crusader of Senti.
It was like really late into the Genesis. Atlas published it. I know that.
Yes. I think it's called Ragna Senti in Europe and Soleil in Japan, or reverse, one of the two. And it's $1,700.
$1,700?
Yes.
Ugh.
This is a Zelda clone, like a full-on. Oh, yeah, I've never seen this.
Yeah, it's not worth $1,700, by the way.
No. See, I paid $500 for Panzer Dragoon Saga.
Same.
Which I thought was too much at the time. Now it's like almost like $1,000. Oh, is it? Yeah, even better.
$1,200.
And I lowballed the guy too. He wanted $700. I was like, give it to me for $5,000. And he was like, sure.
Yeah, I bought it for $5,000 as well. This was back in 2018. That's
when I got mine too.
Yep.
Back when Saturn games were kind of obtainable.
Kind of. And they're spiking because like I just saw Shining Force 3 loose now is $350.
See, I got that when it was like 75, like when it was no one cared about it.
Yep.
I'm trying to get the final 5. Shining Force 3, Panzer Dragoon Saga, Burning Rangers, Magic Knight Rayearth, and House of the Dead 2. And House of the Dead 1.
House of the Dead. Yeah, I've given up. I'm out. I have a mode now for my Sega Saturn, so I can play everything digitally. So I don't even care anymore. I just don't.
I got 3 of them, and then like all the prices. I saw the price for Magic Knight Rayearth, and I was like, "Fuck that!"
$800 now. When I was looking to get it, was about 100. No, it was like 250. I was like, "Yeah, I'm not doing this." And now it's like 800. I'm like, no.
You want to talk about the dumbest expensive game? I got this Iron Storm for the Saturn. It's a Working Designs game. I found it at a retro convention in a bargain bin for $5. It was just sitting there. I'm like, hey, Working Designs, I'll take that.
Of course, yeah.
It's got Hitler on the back of it.
Oh, that works.
I don't know what it is, but I have it.
So Senti's actually a shame purchase on top of me not even knowing, because it was like I wasn't even collecting. I was just buying games, and that's why I have so many PlayStation games now. I'm afraid that don't work because I didn't take care of them. So like the label side is getting scratched, which is what happened to my Skies of Arcadia. That doesn't work anymore because the labels got scratched, and once the label gets scratched, you're fucked. For Crusader of Senti, so I go into this game store. It's called Guerrilla Games. I've been going there for a little while. And this, like, I had no sense of etiquette or anything like that. No clue. So I walk in there and this dude is selling like all these Sega Genesis games, like just a whole box of them. And there was Shining Force 2, all the Phantasy Star games, all the Might and Magic games. And I'm like, I'm damn near shitting my pants, but I'm like, you know what? I want to see what this guy has, and I want to pick some stuff up. So I'm bargaining with this guy at the retro game store and saying, I can give you better prices than they can. I'll buy them off you, which is a giant faux pas, by the way. You shouldn't do that. I learned. I didn't know. They didn't care, which is probably a reason they went out of business much longer. So there's like 7 games I bought from them in a wireless controller. And there's the second one. I just didn't want to do it because I didn't want to. I looked at the games. Like I saw the Phantasy Stars and Shining Force. And of course, I wanted those. And I thought, okay, those are the big money items. I'll take items that I haven't heard of before. It's the Sega Genesis, and this was back in 2013, 2014. So like,
people really didn't care about the Genesis then either.
No. I was thinking Genesis games are like trash, like they're or terms of trash value, not trash games, but trash value, right? They're junk bonds.
Well, because at that point it was like all Super Nintendo and like N64 was like the thing at the time.
Yeah, mostly Super Nintendo. Definitely Super Nintendo at the time. And Dreamcast had its little following, but like no one gave a shit about the Genesis. Nobody. There were 7 games, and I can tell you out of those games, one was Shadowrun. That's not complete in box, but it was boxing game. Beyond Oasis, complete in box, cardboard edition with it still had the shrink wrap on it, but it was open at the top. 3 Dirty Dwarves, Light Crusader, complete in box, and 3 Dirty Dwarves was complete in box. I forgot the other game, and then there was Crusader of Senti, which I saw had Atlas on it. I'd never heard of it before. And the wireless controller with the thing that you can hook into the system. I asked him, how much you want for these? These are the only games I want. The store can have the rest. These are the only games I want. I've never heard of them. I just want to have a good time. And he's like, well, give me an offer. I'm like, $50? He's like, yeah. I'm like,
that was a different time.
I'll give you $50 for all these games. So I bring them all home, and the price charting was just like a thing then. It just started being a thing then. So I looked them up, and I looked up Crusader of Senti, and it said $250, and I damn near shit my pants. I'm like, I looked at my wife. I'm like, Meredith, this game's for $250. And she says, you should sell it. I'm like, I should not sell it. Like, this is the biggest game I've had ever. Like, there's no way I'm dropping this. And now it's a $1,700 game, complete in box. The box is not in the greatest condition, but like, as a collector, it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Especially if it's cardboard. Like, they're just impressed you have it.
Oh yeah, that's like my Phantasy Star 4. That's like my holy grail, the Genesis right now.
Yeah. And still, Genesis games are low price, but they're not being as lowballed as they were 9 years ago.
Yeah,
9 years ago. Nowhere even close.
And it's crazy how many of them you can still find in the case because they use those
clamshells. Clamshells, yeah. Same with Master System. A Master System was dirt cheap too.
Oh yeah,
and that's spiked up. I'm happy. I have about three quarters of the North American Master System releases, but I have all the cheap games, so that's never getting completed. So same with the Wii U.
I just added this from one of my stupid collections. I got Clax on the Master System.
Nice, but that's European, right? It didn't come out in the United States.
No, it's like a white cartridge.
Yeah, that doesn't mean much. Like
Really?
the only thing you can tell with to differentiate between North American and European releases is the instruction manual.
And I don't have that.
Yeah. But Clax didn't come out in the United States, so it doesn't matter.
I knew that because we got the Game Gear version.
Yep.
Clax was my first video game ever, so one of my goals is to get every version of Clax.
It is the 90s, and it is time for Clax. I wish I had on the TurboGrafx. I love that game. That's how I was introduced to it. But if you don't know, and I'm pretty sure you do, so maybe Kate doesn't know, so he can learn this. The way you can tell between a North American and US version of a Master System game is the manual for PAL regions will be horizontal.
Oh, really?
Yep. Whereas the North American versions will be vertical. So like Sonic the Hedgehog for the North American version, I think like all that's identical. Like they didn't change anything. The only difference between the North American and PAL region Sonic the Hedgehog game is that the North American version has a UPC sticker on it.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and because it has a UPC sticker on it, it's like 20 times more valuable. But that's the only difference. You can essentially play, and in terms of PAL and North American, you can play almost every single game released in the PAL region on your NTSC Master System. There's like no region locking.
Yeah, that's true.
That's where I'm at in terms of collecting for the Master System. Is if I can get the PAL and just say I have the PAL version of a game that was released in North America, I say, yep. Because if you just get the cartridge, you can't tell. There's no difference.
Okay. I bought like 30 2600 games for $10 because no one cares.
No one cares.
And I all I wanted was ET to do a review. That was really it. Favorite dumb fact about that whole thing was that before we're completely off the rails now.
Yep.
Atari made more more copies of ET than there was 2600s.
Yes, they did. Same with Pac-Man.
Yeah.
I did not know that. I mean, I knew there was a shit ton of copies, but more than there were actual consoles?
Because they thought it would sell more consoles. It didn't.
Oh.
I mean, a lot of people had an Atari, just you didn't have a gaming culture, and Atari didn't know what they were doing because gaming was in its infancy. So of course they thought, hey, if we make something that people need to play this on and they buy it, they're going to buy our console too. Like they didn't understand video game economics because nothing had been established by that.
No one had figured it out yet. Yeah.
Nope.
We didn't have Nintendo to fix everything yet.
Mm-mm.
A lot of that had been figured out by Generation 4.
Oh shit, we're actually doing an episode.
We've been doing it for a while. I want to get you guys this like dynamic going just in a different direction. So I want to start maybe like Bill, what is the most obscure fact or most interesting fact about that generation? Just in your perspective, that'll just get the ball rolling and I'll let you two go off.
Generation 5, technically it's like there's like 7 to like 12 different consoles if you want to be technical of the consoles in this generation. But if we're just going to talk about the big 3 of the Saturn, N64, and PlayStation, interesting fact I learned is there's like only a handful of games that actually released on all 3 of those systems.
64 and Saturn?
Yep, Saturn, 64, and PlayStation. The only 2 I can think of, Duke Nukem 3D.
Oh, yeah.
Yep.
Mortal Kombat Trilogy.
The trilogy was on 64? I didn't know
I'm
that.
more surprised it was on Saturn. I thought Mortal Kombat Gold was on 64. It wasn't called Trilogy.
No, Mortal Kombat Gold was the Dreamcast game.
Okay.
Actually.
Yeah. I'm not sure about the 64 because I remember playing a Mortal Kombat game near launch. Was it Trilogy?
Yeah.
Oh, well, okay. Awesome.
It's like one of the two, because I know Duke Nukem and then Trilogy, because Gold was the
I like how you're just picking it out like over there. Yeah,
Gold
right.
was on the Dreamcast.
Yeah.
What was the time gap difference between the Saturn launching and the 64 launching? Because I remember the 64 came out after PS1.
Yes.
There's a big gap, right?
So 64 was late, like significantly
That's
later.
what I thought. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, a year and a half from the Saturn, a year from the PlayStation. That's kind of how, yeah.
Well, because say, I guess technically you want to start from the beginning. This generation technically starts, I guess, with the 3DO.
The 3DO.
It might have been the 3DO. There may have been something before it. I don't know, because that generation is complete dumpster fire. It's a mess. Because you had the Jaguar, you had the 3DO, you had the CDI, you had the Pippin.
I think CDI was Gen 4 technically. I know the Jaguar was after 3DO because the famous Jaguar commercial, Do the Math, mentions the 3DO in its ad.
Yeah. I mean, of the major consoles, because there was crazy shit coming out. FM Towns Marty was one of them. The PC, whatever came after the
PCFX.
PCFX,
the one that looks like a PC tower.
Yeah, and it was trash. It was a porn console. Good for it, but yeah, no one bought it.
Never came out over here.
No, it didn't, and no one in Japan bought it either. For what it's worth.
No,
yeah, good for you. You had a successful console, and then you failed.
Yeah, there was the Amiga CD32.
Which also kind of sucked. I mean, it did better than the PC FX.
Did all of these I had the 3DO where I played a few 3DOs.
I am a staunch supporter of the 3DO. So
yeah,
it's redundant though.
Yeah, you have that episode I've listened to about the 3DO, or you talked about 3DO games.
We did a whole 3DO retrospective.
Yeah, that's the one I think I'm thinking of. My question is did like the CDI, the 3DO, did all of those? It sounds like you're saying they came out earlier. Were they all phased out and dying by the time 64 came around?
Jaguar definitely. Like Jaguar did not last very long at all.
No.
3DO. So 3DO lasted long enough that they were at the first E3.
I think of the 3DO as the Wii U.
You love the Wii U, so you must love the 3DO.
No.
See, he loves the Wii U. I love the 3DO.
There it is.
But if you said the 3DO is like the Wii U and you love the Wii U, why don't you love the 3DO?
Because I didn't have a 3DO.
Oh, fair enough.
So here, I guess I'll talk about the 3DO real quick. The whole concept behind the 3DO was it was created by the founder of EA, Trip Hawkins, and he created the 3DO company. And his whole idea was, rather than making a console, he wanted to create like a video game standard, kind of like Blu-rays or like DVDs, VHS.
Smart.
The problem is,
yeah, you told me this.
The problem is gaming is constantly evolving, so it would never work.
No, I mean that's what PC became. So
yeah. But his whole idea was the 3DO company would design the specs, but they wouldn't actually make the console. They'd license it out to different contractors. So the most famous ones were Panasonic, Gold Star, and Sanyo. The Panasonic is the most famous one. Like that's the one that I have that looks like a VCR.
Mm-hmm.
The Gold Star one was the cheaper alternative, which is kind of, I used a Gold Star once. They're kind of a piece of shit, to be honest, as compared to the Panasonics. Then the Sanyo only came out in Japan. That was the Japanese version.
Mm-hmm.
And then 3DO, then Panasonic later made like a top-loading one for cheaper.
CDI was made with the same mentality as well. It wasn't really meant to be a video game system, actually. It was meant to be just more of a media system. It was almost like if you made an Xbox One, but you didn't make it for video games, that's the CDI, or at least the concept behind it.
Yeah. I mean, the 3DO at least kind of was trying to be a video game console.
Yeah, primarily it was trying to be a video game console. I don't think there's any denying that it was trying to be a video game console. But you're right, it was.
Yeah,
I wouldn't even call it a disaster.
Oh no, it sold 2 million units. It wasn't. I mean, it failed, but it wasn't.
It's a flop. Yeah,
it wasn't like a colossal failure.
It was too expensive. It launched for like $600 or some shit like that.
The thing was, 3DO's licensing was, they wouldn't make money off the consoles. They'd make money off all the games. So they sold really low licensing fees on the games.
Mm-hmm.
It was kind of like the razor and blade theory. You don't make money off the razor, you make money off the blades.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is though, like Panasonic, the 3DO is ridiculously over-designed, like especially the FC1 model, the original one. So the only way they were ever going to make money off the thing was it was like $700 at launch.
Yeah. And
the games, while it had good games, there wasn't really anything significant that really made it so you needed a 3DO.
Well, EA they were a good developer, but they weren't competing against the likes of Nintendo and Sega. Like Japan, like the Western developers hadn't figured out how to move away from the PC yet.
Mhm.
So when it came to consoles, the 3DO was attracting Western developers, save a few titles. But
Yes.
but the Western developers were just starting to figure out how to make games for console, in my opinion. Like you had some standouts like Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo, but you also had it on a controller with 3 buttons, unless you special ordered a controller from Capcom, which ridiculous.
It's shaped like it doesn't look like a controller.
No. It looks like I can't even describe it. I'm not even going to try.
I've been trying to find one, and they're not easy to find, believe it or
But
not.
there's a Street Fighter only controller for the 3DO.
So the 3DO had like thousands of different third-party controllers.
Oh, okay, that makes sense. I guess if they're also licensing different consoles, they're probably.
So I have both a Panasonic and a Gold Star controller, and they look significantly different.
You also have to daisy chain them in order to play.
Oh yeah, it's the funniest thing ever. Yeah, the controllers are ridiculously long cords, but you daisy chain them one by one to play multiplayer. When me and Alex were playing for the podcast episode we did, we were in the middle of playing Balls 3D, and I kept like unplugging on her.
I didn't know that came out for the 3DO.
Yeah, it had a definitive port, quote unquote definitive.
Yeah, definitive. But it had some standouts. It had a Road Rash.
Road Rash is one. Shockwave was like this airplane.
Shockwave was good.
Yeah.
Blade Force.
Gex.
The problem with 3DO games is all of its standouts are on other systems now.
And they're better.
Yes.
Need for Speed. Yeah.
Gex is debatable because people say the 3DO port of Gex is the best version, but it's a 2D platformer. You're nitpicking at that point.
Yeah, it's a nitpicky point. It's kind of like the Jaguar version of Rayman is good. The Jaguar version of Raiden is good. And they may be the definitive versions of those games. It doesn't fucking matter though, because you're not going to play a fucking Jaguar.
Well, unless you're me, but I'm a weirdo.
Well, I mean, I would if I had one, but like the average person isn't going to go out of their way to play Rayman on the Jaguar if you can get a PlayStation or Saturn version. That's all I'm saying.
That's actually one of the funniest things is Alex utterly despises the N64 but loves the Jaguar for whatever reason.
That makes sense. The N64 does suck.
Okay, Alex will get along with you. We did an N64 episode, and Alex the whole episode was like, I hate this thing. It sucks. I'm like,
it does suck.
Jesus Christ.
Who hurt you? Who at Nintendo hurt you? Damn.
Nintendo.
She hates the controller. That's what it was.
I'm not a huge fan of the controller.
Here's an obscure point. You want an obscure point? It's not too obscure because it doesn't take long to research, but nobody knows this when you talk about the Saturn, because everyone's like, oh, the Saturn sucked. No one likes the Saturn. And you do say, like, people do know that the Saturn was successful in Japan, but what they don't know is Saturn was second place in Japan. The N64 was third in Japan.
Yes.
Like the N64 was a fucking bomb. It just failed.
Oh yeah.
And it makes sense. This is why you don't have really traditional Japanese centric games on the N64. You have games that are more successful for a Western market.
You want to know a key game that hurt the N64 more than anything?
What's that?
Dragon Quest.
No. I mean, I would say Dragon Quest did, but it was Final Fantasy VII. That was the. Yeah.
To be fair, Japan loves Dragon Quest way more than Final Fantasy.
Of course. I agree with you, but the future of Dragon Quest was in question.
True.
And then you had Final Fantasy VII come out on the PlayStation in 97. And when that was announced, no one wanted an N64.
Oh, yeah. Because the N64 has 5 RPGs total.
And they all suck. Except for Ogre Battle 64 and Paper Mario. Yeah, that's about it.
Hybrid Heaven isn't a good game, but it's cool. It's interesting.
Is it really an RPG, though?
It's close enough. You got to be nitpicky. Iodine Chronicle isn't really, or whatever it's called, is barely an RPG as well.
The N64 was a massive flop for Nintendo. Like that was, everyone looks at the GameCube and was like, how did the GameCube fail? I mean, how did the GameCube fail? Yeah, because the N64 failed. Yeah, people got that in their homes and they're like, yeah, this is shit. This is awful. In Japan.
It also didn't help that Sony just took off this generation. Yeah. These two generations are like the literal definition of curb stop battle.
Yeah. Should we start at the beginning then? Because I mean, we're kind of all over the place. So I'm sure Kate is like, I see him. He's just sitting there like, what the fuck, guys? Like, I don't know what's going on.
I'm trying to think.
This is kind of what Kate wanted, to be honest.
Yeah, I guess so, yeah.
I'm confused at the timeline, though. So you're saying the big three are the Saturn, the 64, and the PlayStation. But you're also...
big two.
Well, the 64 in America, I mean, at least the 64 in Utah, where I grew up, was the King Kong. Like everyone, maybe. Yeah. So I don't know if that's just the United States.
I'm in New England. In my hometown, I was the one weird kid with a PlayStation.
Okay. So there was pockets that the 64 was successful, I guess. I didn't know
North
it did so
America.
bad. Yeah, I didn't know it did so bad inside. But
Before we go to the beginning, I actually I heard an analogy once about an N64 fan versus a PlayStation fan that really made a lot of sense. You talk to any N64 fan, a lot of the times they will talk about the same games like that they loved. Like they had the same selection of games that were like their definitive titles that they praised the system for. You talk to two PlayStation owners, you're going to get completely different like
Very good
selections of
point.
games.
Very good point.
Because the PlayStation had such diverse like category of games.
It's my favorite console. You don't have to preach to me. I'm already on board.
It's mine.
You can have a diverse set of games when you sold over 100 million systems.
Mm-hmm.
If you've sold 100 million consoles, you're going to get every third-party developer jumping onto your console, especially with the licensing fees much lower and the production fees much lower.
The compact disc, that was the key.
Yeah, that's what I mean by production fees.
Yeah,
it's like you can spend like what, a quarter per disc, where as opposed to a cartridge, it's what, like $20-$30 to make a cartridge.
Is that much difference in the hard cost?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
I did not realize that.
Yeah.
They could hold they held significantly less data. Their only upside was the load times.
The loading. Yeah.
Oh, and its sound quality was significantly worse because they couldn't hold nearly as much data.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on the sound that they're using too. I mean, there's some really good sounding N64 titles.
Oh yeah, that's true.
Especially compared if they want to use the PlayStation system memory. I think the N64 is about similar, I would argue. But PlayStation can have CD quality music. So the N64 has compressed CD quality music, but it's not as good.
That's why most N64 games just use MIDIs.
Yeah, of course.
It's just easier.
MIDI's fine. I mean, the composer of Dragon Quest thought so.
That's true. Yeah. Yeah.
Infamously. I wouldn't say famously, infamously, probably. Yeah, let's go back to the beginning.
For like a lot of listeners, maybe like me, or just not as deep in the rabbit holes you guys, when does the generation start? So you guys will say it's like it's kind of middle with Jaguar 3DO.
So this generation's kind of split into like two. There's like the early consoles, and then there's the main ones.
That's what I was getting at earlier. Yeah. So walk us through that.
Just for the sake of brevity, like we can just kind of shrink those early consoles in the method that we already did. So there was the 3DO, there was the CDI, there was the Jaguar, and no one bought that shit. And they were waiting on the big three.
Can I talk about the Jaguar real quick though? Just because
absolutely,
the Jaguar is. I like to call the Jaguar like the most misunderstood console there ever was.
How is it misunderstood?
Well, it's the company that made it didn't understand it to begin with.
Okay.
I've done like a full deep dive into like the Jaguar like lore, just because like I have a fascination for like these like obscure like I have a freaking Virtual Boy. I love these like stupid things. So I actually looked deep into like the Jaguar's history. My biggest problem with the Jaguar was the way it was designed was like never going to work. So it was designed with, it had this really advanced like main CPU called the Tom chip, and it had this really advanced sound card called the Jerry chip. Haha.
And people use the sound chip sometimes as the main chip. Is that what you're getting at? I learned this. Haha.
The problem was there was no it didn't actually have a dedicated CPU. So what they did was, to compensate for this, was they threw in a Motorola 68000 as the control CPU.
That's awful.
Exactly. And the problem is most developers at the time were familiar with the Motorola 6800 because that is the main CPU in the Genesis. It is the main CPU in the Neo Geo. The Super Nintendo didn't have it, but it was a very common off the shelf chip, and it was designed just to be a managing chip. It wasn't supposed to actually do any of the actual hardware.
It's also 6 years old by that point.
Yes, which is one of the biggest flaws with the Jaguar. So most games, you could do a lot with like the main CPU, but the problem was it didn't know what to do with what you were telling it, because it was like there was nothing to control where it was going. So most developers ignored the main chip and just used the 6800. And then they'd use the sound card as as like a secondary processor. So a lot of the games didn't have sound because of that, because the sound chip was being used for other things. And all that just kind of became like this one mess. That's why the whole it's not technically 64-bit argument comes out. I mean, technically, if you want to be technical, it's a 32-bit system at most.
Like the TurboGrafx 16.
Yeah, because that's technically 8-bit.
Right.
It had like two 64-bit like blitters, which whatever those are, that were added to it that technically added up to 64-bit. So I guess like if you look at like its most well-known games, like Tempest 2000, Alien versus Predator, Rayman,
Rayman
looks identical to the PlayStation and Saturn version. It has a shittier soundtrack, but the other two had CD quality audio.
Cybernator, probably very famous.
That's another good one.
Yes,
it's not good, but it's famous.
Attack of the Mutant Penguins, one of the most mindfucky games ever made.
I have a couple of questions about Jaguar I wanted to bring up while we're on it. So do you guys know 16-Bit? He's a Canadian collector on Instagram. I think I've seen you guys interact with his stuff before.
Maybe.
He might. I think he's liked a couple of my photos. I don't think he's ever directly reached out to me.
Yeah, he spells it out 16, like the letters and the word, not the number. Anyway.
Oh, you did it. You did an episode with him, right?
I did an episode with him.
Okay,
he messaged me something the other day I thought was interesting. He said, I've always wanted to do a mini series called Atari Did It First and talk about the things they broke ground on. Wireless controllers for the 2600.
True.
This is not just Jaguar, but Atari. Online play via Game Line. 5200 had 24 controller ports. Certain 2600 games had enhancement chips. 5200 had the first analog controllers. 7800 had built-in backwards compatibility, and the Jaguar CD is the first CD add-on.
No, the Jaguar CD was not the first CD.
No. The Sega CD and the TurboGrafx CD.
Turbo CD was.
Yeah.
But I mean, a lot of that thing is like, congratulations, you're the first major console developer on the market. Yeah, you're going to be first. Like, duh. Yeah. Oh, so you're trying new things in the 80s like everyone else was. Okay. You were been around since 1976 on the console market. I mean, even longer if you go back to the Pong consoles, and you're going to say Atari did it first. Yeah, of course they did it first. They were first. They weren't the first 16-bit console. That was the Intellivision.
Yeah, that's a forgotten thing that a lot of people don't know.
They were the first developer to bitch about everyone making games that they couldn't compete. I mean, they can't do that with Nintendo because they essentially put Magnavox out of business with Casey Munchkin going after them because it looks too much like Pac-Man. Yeah, when your version of Pac-Man is fucking trash and you can't let people play fucking Casey Munchkin. Yeah, I get it. Yeah, Atari did it first.
Sorry, Cam. We're not talking shit on you, I was just using you as a talking point.
Atari. It's fucking Atari. Of course Atari did it first. Of course Atari did it first. That's like saying Babylon did things first in terms of civilization. No shit.
I like you, Cam, by the way, if you listen to this.
I have nothing against this person.
I've never met him. I watched the episode. He seems like a nice guy.
He's a super nice guy. We were just chatting, and I think I might have mixed up the Jaguar CD.
Well, the Jaguar CD, just to get on that, is the most stupidly designed system ever made.
No, you told me that the Jaguar died quick. How long was it around before they tried to throw this CD crap on it? And then how long did that last?
Well, the CD was added like very late, like right towards the end of its production.
But it was announced like before the system launched too. It's like, what?
Along with a virtual reality helmet.
That never launched.
Yeah. It looked like janky as shit.
Wait, they were going to do a VR for the Jaguar?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And the Genesis too.
Huh.
So it lasted a total of 3 years. It went from 93 to 96.
Yeah, kind of.
Didn't the PS1 come out in 95?
Five.
So it crossed over for a year. Okay.
They all were on the market, I think, at one point, but it was a very short window.
That's what I was trying to get at earlier. So yeah, at what point were like the timeline they were all on the market for like 6 months to a year? It sounds like the early ones that overlapped with the later part of this generation.
Some of them, they're dead by the time the N64 came out.
I think the Jaguar was just dying at the time.
Officially dying. Not like because it was like sales wise, it was dead.
Yeah.
But like for Atari to come out and say, yeah, it's dead.
The 3DO sold an estimated like 2 million units total. The Jaguar sold like 150,000.
Oh, that's nothing. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's why they're so expensive. That makes sense.
The systems themselves are pretty It's the games that suck to collect right now.
And the thing is, that's the pathetic part. This is how shitty the Jaguar is. And I know you have a soft spot or your sister has a soft spot for it, Bill.
No, I love it too because it's stupid. Okay. I love stupid consoles.
The thing is that it sucks so much that the system itself is still relatively affordable in the big scheme of things. And the games itself are still cheaper than most of your Saturn collections. And they're certainly cheaper than a Neo Geo game. So like no one wants it.
The only Atari Jaguar games that are going to cost you a fortune are like obviously Rayman. But if you're buying Rayman on the Jaguar, like me, you're just buying it because you're a psycho collector.
Yeah.
Because literally the PlayStation version you can get anywhere.
Yeah.
And then there's another expensive one is like Attack of the Mutant Penguins, but that game's a meme.
Most games on the Jaguar are a meme.
True. It does have good games. Like it has like the best home console port of Doom at the time.
Yeah, it wasn't like the Super Nintendo version was based off the Jaguar version.
Except for there's no music on the Doom version.
Fun fact: the Super Nintendo version is the one version that was not based off of the Jaguar version.
Yeah, I thought like there was a lot of versions that were based off the Jaguar version. Like they worked with that to port it to other systems.
It actually made the Jaguar version. That was the only one that they worked on themselves, and every version, except for the Super Nintendo, was based off of that one. Like 32X is the same.
Yeah,
PlayStation's the same.
PlayStation is the best port, by the way, of that time.
Best soundtrack too.
I would debate you on that. I think the best soundtrack is the 3DO version. And the only reason I say that is because the 3DO version has a bitchin' soundtrack.
I'd have to listen to the 3DO version. I've probably never even heard it, to be honest.
And just to get off track, because I love this story, I have to talk about how 3DO Doom happened. So it was the rights to the game were bought by this company called Art Data Interactive. And the guy who was running Art Data Interactive, his idea of how to make a game was literally buy a PC copy of the game and just slap it on a 3DO and be like, it's done. There was one woman that was programming it from scratch, and she literally was like, that's not how games work. And he basically response was, it needs to be done in like 6 weeks. See ya.
I wonder why it failed.
Yeah, she basically had to work day and night to get this thing barely functioning. But the fun fact about it is, rather than recompose the music to play on the 3DO's like MIDI like instruments, the owner of Art Data was actually like in a church band, and he was actually a pretty solid musician. So he had his band do the soundtrack.
What? Now I want to listen to it.
It is like a super loose interpretation of the classic Doom soundtrack, but it is like rocking. Like it is super like 80s like butt rock. It's super awesome.
Huh. I must be getting some stories mixed up because I thought maybe there's similar stories. I thought the Super Nintendo version of Doom, I thought I listened to a podcast episode about a woman who was like a code wizard that made that version in a short amount of time as well. Or am I getting that mixed up with the 3DO version?
You might be getting it mixed up with 3DO, because I think the Super Nintendo was made by Sculpted Software.
Huh. I'm probably getting it mixed up then. How does that work with licensing? They're just like, you guys can do whatever you want with the music. If your church band wants to do it, that's fine.
Well, it's the same music, like note for note. It's just a different interpretation of it.
Yeah, it's just a recording. Yeah, it's a different recording. Too much data in the head. Can't keep it all straight. You guys have no problem keeping it all straight. Seems like when it comes to video games.
Well, I can't remember anything else, but I can remember video game knowledge. So.
There you go. So the other thing I have, I think I follow the timeline. So you have like the generations sort of split into two halves. They overlap in a little bit.
Sony made the sound card for the Super Nintendo, started a brief partnership with Nintendo. They proposed an idea to make a CD add-on for the Super Nintendo. Sony got sneaky in the background and decided to make it so they would get all the money for the CD-based games.
They didn't get sneaky. That was all up front. And Nintendo was like, oh, we fucked up. Nintendo was like, oops.
So Nintendo didn't like that. Rather than try and work it out, they decided to go behind Sony's back, work with Philips. That's how the CDI games happened. And then they embarrassed Sony on stage by announcing they were doing the Philips thing. The Sony thing was nothing.
The same show Sony announced they were making the PlayStation.
Yes.
Nintendo came out and said, no, we're not.
Yeah.
That's what I was trying to get at. Yeah.
Yeah.
It was like,
yeah.
And then the designer of the thing, Ken Kutaragi, goes up to his the president of Sony and basically says, we're not going to lose this. We're going to make one better.
Yeah.
And they did.
A long roundabout way. They created the PlayStation. But it's kind of funny because the story doesn't exactly end there, because Sega was also hanging out in the background at this point.
Yeah. Sony went to Sega first. And they said, hey, do you want to kill Nintendo? They're like, nah, man. We're good. We're good.
The funniest part about Sega is, too, at the same time, because a lot of people don't realize this, Sega of America and Sega of Japan, they hated each other. Like, they legitimately despised each other. And I think a lot of it had to do with the fact that Sega like kicked ass in America and wasn't that spectacular in Japan.
No, they sucked in America. They sucked in Japan. They were awful in Japan.
They were particularly popular in Europe and like South America too.
Yes. South America meaning Brazil.
And by Brazil, I mean the Master System only.
Yes.
But aside from that, I've heard this story many times and I've told it, but I'm not 100% sure if it's exactly true, but I've read a story that Sega of America they started working with a company called Silicon Graphics. They'll come into play later. And came up with the specs for a super powerful system that was great with 3D and like would have been like way ahead of its time for the time. And Sega of Japan vetoed it just because Sega of America came up with it.
Yep. Ted Kalinske was like, this is cool. Sega of Japan was like, no, it's not.
Yeah, and right before Tom Kalinske resigned and moved on, he told the Silicon Graphics, "Hey, you might want to take this to another company because this thing is going to be the future."
Like Nintendo.
Yeah, and that became a system called the Ultra 64.
Is that the? I have a YouTube video bookmark that I haven't watched yet from a lady called Lady Decade. She does like video game history.
Yeah, she's good.
She has the Sega Ultra 64. Is that what you're referencing?
Okay, that's probably it then.
That's probably
I've heard
it?
this
Okay.
story multiple times.
Okay, we keep going backwards in time, so let's move forwards to the best console in the world, the PlayStation.
Well, I guess before that though, the Saturn technically Saturn comes first technically.
Let's set the stage here because we're just bouncing all over the place. Let's
It's
get some
fine.
continuity here. We've talked about the 3DO. 3DO's dead. Okay, it's in the past. Bye. Jaguar's dead. CDI, we don't even care about it. The Apple Pippin, let's not even discuss it. Okay, no one gives a shit about the Apple Pippin. There's probably a bunch of no one gives a shit about the FM Towns Marty, except like collectors who have like $100,000 they just want to burn for no fucking reason.
Steve Jobs didn't even care about the Pippin.
No one cared about the Pippin. Wasn't Steve Jobs out of Apple at that point?
Yeah, the first thing he did when he came back was he killed the Pippin.
Yeah, that's right. He killed it. Here's how things are going. So the big three. So the 3DO is there, is just kind of in the background. It costs too much money for any reasonable person to purchase. So it's around. Sega's fucking up big time because they released the Sega CD, which did okay. It's not as much of a colossal failure as everyone says it was, but it is doing okay.
And it has great games that no one knows about.
Yes, it certainly does. And there's plenty of games for the Sega CD I absolutely love. But then all of a sudden, Sega of Japan decides to get a wild hair up their ass. And they say, hey, look, we want the Sega Genesis because it's so successful in North America to have a cute little add-on called the 32X. So they announced the 32X. And while they announced the 32X in North America, Sega of Japan decides to say, hey, we're going to do this Saturn thing. That's going to be a 2D powerhouse. In spite of the fact they are like the leaders in 3D technology, they decide to make a system that is a 2D powerhouse.
Cut in real quick.
Yeah.
Biggest irony, too, is the thing that inspired Ken Kutaragi in the PlayStation.
I was going to say that. Yep.
Was freaking Virtual Fighter.
Yes.
Of all things.
That's the thing. Sega in the arcades was coming out with Virtua Racing, Virtua Fighter,
Daytona USA.
I think Virtua Cop. They had 3D games. 3D. They are the leading company in terms of quality 3D entertainment. And they make a system that is based around 2D gaming. It's based around 2D gaming. Supposed to be the most powerful 2D gaming powerhouse. And in early development, I think this PlayStation was supposed to be a 2D powerhouse as well. Like that's where they were starting. And then, like you said, they saw Virtua Fighter. Yeah. They saw Virtua Fighter and they're like, hey, let's make a 3D system. So then they start making a 3D system. All of a sudden, Sega goes, oh, shit. Because they saw what Sony was doing. And they're like, so it gets to like this point in 1994, right? For like 3 or 6 months before launch. And Sega's like, we're going to jam a couple extra processors in this motherfucker.
Rather than
just to make sure.
Yes.
Rather than redesign it, they took their core motherboard with all this shit to make it a 2D powerhouse. And it was like, here's another processor. Yes. Here's some processors, more processors. It's just going to work.
The best thing, though, that is the norm nowadays. Like that's just that's what they do nowadays.
But everything's in x86 architecture. Back then, it was different. Like they were all custom or PowerPC or some shit. Sega is becoming extremely hard to develop for. They have lost market share to Nintendo because Donkey Kong Country is fucking smashing them. It just completely took their lunch. They took them by surprise because Nintendo is doing stuff on the Super Nintendo it was never supposed to do. And now they're trying to figure it out. Virtual Racing didn't work out for the Sega Genesis because it cost $100 for a game.
That was the problem.
Yeah. So they couldn't, like, they lost trust with the Sega CD, kind of. They lost trust with the 32X. And they're like, no, now buy the Saturn. But it wasn't that wasn't even the worst part with the Saturn.
Keep in mind at this point, the Master System was still on sale. The Genesis was still on sale. The Game Gear was still on sale. The Sega CD was still on sale.
No, Master System was dead. It was dead. Well, in North America. Oh,
that's fair. I think it was just kind of went away at that point.
So, and the 32X, I it was kind of like the TurboGrafx 16 in Japan. Like, I don't even think it was kind of like one of those farts that don't smell. That's the 32X in Japan and pretty much anywhere else.
It has two games worth playing on it.
So Sega at like E3, and they've been building up to the Saturn because, of course, they're Sega. People have to listen to Sega, even though they've almost completely lost consumer confidence and trust. They are coming out with a new system called the Saturn. which I think people are already confused about what the future of Sega is. It's a 32X of the Saturn, but we're going to see what they say about the Saturn. They say it's going to cost $400, and this was E3 95. And not only is it going to cost $400, but it's going to come out
right now,
next week. Yeah, right now.
It was like literally right then.
It's in your retailers, and you might be thinking to yourself today. What's wrong with that? Nintendo does this all the time in the directs. Why would it matter if they said, yeah, it's in retailers today at major retailers? You can go get it.
They didn't tell their developers.
One, they didn't tell the developers because it was already out in Japan in '94 and it was doing okay in Japan. It was kind of keeping up the PlayStation in Japan. So they came out and they said, okay, it's going to be launched tomorrow. And they didn't tell all the developers, nor the Western developers. Most importantly, and this is what I think really killed the Saturn, they didn't tell all of their retailers.
Oh, yeah.
So KB Toys wasn't aware of that. I think I don't know if Toys R Us was or not, but like Babbage's, EB Games, KB Toys, they weren't made aware. So they didn't have inventory. They didn't have the system. So KB Toys completely gave up. And if you don't know what KB Toys is, obviously it's an old toy company from like the that like died in like the early 2000s, mid 2000s or something like that.
Late 2000s, because there was one in the mall. They actually brought it back as an online retailer.
Oh, cool. Good for them. So they announced that. So they pissed off the retailers. They pissed off developers. And they said it was going to be $400. But I think it came with a game and a demo disc and 2 controllers, which, okay, fair.
The greatest like FUs in gaming history. Back when Sony was cool, like the cool guys. The Sony comes up for their presentation. And the guy doing the presentation literally steps up on the stage, gets up to the mic, and just says one famous line, $299.
$299.
Walks off. And the entire crowd goes nuts.
$100 cheaper than the Saturn, more powerful, more 3D focused, easier to develop for, better licensing.
I will say the more power thing is debatable because I don't think we ever truly figured out what the Saturn was capable of.
Well, for 3D games, it's more powerful. I don't think that's even a question. I think for 2D games, I think that's also not a question.
True.
So the Saturn is far better at 2D games.
I will say though, I feel like the Saturn's 3D technology, if actually like optimized, which it never happened, there's theories that it might have actually been more powerful.
We won't know. A lot of people, I mean, a lot of the things I've seen too is that it would not have been, but you also have to remember it had a different polygon processing
because it used quadrilaterals rather than triangles.
Yes.
Like I will say games like Panzer Dragoon Saga and like Burning Rangers look amazing.
I just played Burning Rangers on emulator with all the extra shit, and it was like it's not that.
I don't know.
Bulk Slash looks amazing.
Bulk Slash looks fucking awesome. Like the art style is amazing. Yeah.
I don't know. I kind of liked it, but
the draw distance is shit.
I'll give you that. I thought the polygons actually looked pretty good though.
The polygons look absolutely fucking amazing. That game is, if you want to know what like the Saturn can do at full power in a 3D environment, play Bulk Slash. That's a fantastic example of what it can do. But it doesn't still, I mean, of course the Saturn, if it went a couple more years, maybe it could have done something different. But even Bulk Slash it can't compete against Final Fantasy VIII or Final Fantasy IX. It's not even in the same league.
That's true.
It's not even close. But at the same point, like, can the PlayStation do X-Men versus Street Fighter? No.
Not to the same level, anyways.
And if you want to say, the RAM card, okay, go compare Street Fighter Alpha 2 or Street Fighter 02 between the two consoles. It's not even close. I mean, it is close. I mean, it's different nowadays when you look back. But back then, it's like, Saturn's is the superior version. More frames of animation.
Grandia 1 is much better on the Saturn.
I won't say much, but it is better. Well, it is better.
Like I said, 2D games, you get kind of nitpicky.
Exactly. Well, like in entire generations, like especially in retrospect, it's hard to say much because you put them side by side.
There were definitely some better. I just watched a video on. Did you guys play Power Slave?
Oh, I love Power Slave.
It's a marvel of engineering. Same with Duke Nukem 3D.
Power Slave was built on the Slave Driver engine, which they later used to make. They made Quake and Duke Nukem 3D on it,
which is fantastic. Those games they look amazing. They play buttery smooth. They are the best ports of that game in that generation, I think, my personal opinion.
Duke Nukem 3D is an anomaly to me because all 3 ports are significantly different, but they're all good for their own ways.
That's how Power Slave is. I watched this Digital Foundry or whatever, and like the PlayStation and the Saturn version are quite different. Level geometry, different from the PC version. I didn't know that Duke Nukem was the same way. I guess it doesn't surprise me since Power Slave's like that as well. What's the difference between the Duke Nukems?
The name of the developer right now escapes me. They mastered the Saturn.
Lobotomy software.
Lobotomy software. They fucking mastered the Saturn. They were fantastic.
They figured it out.
But the thing is, too, is that when the Saturn came out, and like it'd been out in Japan for a while, as was custom at the time, they launched with Virtua Fighter and Daytona USA, I think, were the games that were available at launch. The crazy thing about Virtua Fighter, when it came out with the Saturn at the time, is this is supposed to be your next generation console. And yes, it looks a little bit better than the 32X, but it has less modes.
Yes.
And it doesn't play as well as the 32X version.
Yeah, the 32X version is actually really good, surprisingly.
You have this gimped version of your marquee game as a launch game for your new Keystone console. And it's not as good as the game that's running on your fucking 10-year-old, almost 10-year-old hardware.
Yep. Me being the racing fan, port of Daytona USA had severe clipping and draw distance issues.
Also awful. And they're big, popular games. These were arcade games. They were popular. Arcade was still king. But the other thing is they weren't really providing any experience that was really, really getting big with the gaming population. Was give me something more than the arcade. As I said, Donkey Kong Country was eating Sega's lunch. The momentum was already going Nintendo's way with the Super Nintendo for the Genesis, but like Donkey Kong Country solidified it. They put the nail in the coffin. So they needed to get away from arcade gaming in a sense. But when you came out with an arcade game, because Sony did it too to great success with games like Tekken, you got to offer more than what the arcade is offering, and Sega didn't do that.
Yeah, it's true.
The 32X version did, but no one bought that. Why are you going to buy it?
32X version of Virtual Racer was really good too.
And Ridge Racer, you could play your own CDs. Ridge Racer, I can go back right now and I would say I would rather play Daytona USA over Ridge Racer in a heartbeat. But back in '95, no way, no fucking way. Like you're doing Ridge Racer all day.
What's crazy too is they later remade both of those with updated re-releases.
Then they're far better.
Well, the Daytona USA Championship Edition is weird because it runs better, but it plays worse.
I hate Championship Edition.
Well, they changed the controls. The game runs better, but the controls suck.
And the funny thing about Virtua Fighter Remix is that if you want to know how bad Virtua Fighter was when the Saturn launched, if you want to know how terrible it was, if you showed proof of purchase that you bought the Saturn and you got Virtua Fighter, Sega sent you a free copy of Virtua Fighter Remix.
Yeah.
Wow.
That's how bad that was.
I don't even have Remix. I should really get that at some point. I have Fighting Vipers instead.
Now, Fighting Vipers is a great game.
You can play as the car from Daytona USA.
That's Fighters Meg Mix.
Oh, never. That's
yep.
You're right. I'm mixing them up.
Another great game that everyone should play.
You could play as the character from Fighting Vipers in Mega Mix. That's what it was.
Yes. And you could play as Pepsi Man in the Japanese version of Fighting Vipers. You can unlock it.
Was he on the Saturn?
Pepsi Man? Yeah. No. Red to Hero was.
Oh, okay.
I think Red to Hero. But Pepsi Man was in the Japanese version of Fighting Vipers.
Really? Okay,
that's the North American one. Yeah. But so Sega released sometime in May of '95, and Sony was in September. And I would argue that even though I think Sega probably had the better software, first of all, they were going like a complete NEC TurboGrafx route of bringing over the shittiest games that they could to make the system good. So first of all, terrible strategy. They had lost consumer confidence with the 32X and Sega CD and just mixed marketing, and they didn't have a clear direction. They were still heavily advertising on the Genesis, much at the request of Sega Japan. Like it was sending mixed messaging. Does Sega want you to buy a Saturn, or do they want you to continue to purchase for the Genesis? Because it looked like they wanted you to continue to purchase for the Genesis. Sonic 3D Blast, case in point. And then you get to Sony, and you look at Sony's launch lineup, and it's like crap.
Yeah, a lot of people don't realize the PlayStation was kind of a dud at first.
Major dud.
Very early, anyways.
What was like the best game? Like Jumping Flash?
I was gonna say I had it at launch, and all I remember having was Jumping Flash and that 2D like WWE arcade wrestling game.
WrestleMania,
I think.
Or, something like that. Royal Rumble.
Not a whole lot in the beginning. Yeah.
Yeah, like ESPN Extreme Sports, I think, which was made by Konami, which was out. You had Raiden Trad or the Raiden Project.
Yeah.
Raiden Project.
Battle Arena Toshinden, I think, was out.
Okay, that's important.
That
Battle
game
Arena
is actually pretty
Toshinden,
good.
it's extremely important.
I
And
know.
the reason it's extremely important is because this goes back to the Virtua Fighter point. Virtua Fighter was such a terrible port on the Saturn that Battle Arena Toshinden, if you ask anyone who plays it today, they'll tell you that game is a piece of shit. But in 1995, it absolutely slaughtered Virtua Fighter.
So that game was actually specifically brought to the PlayStation by a specific individual at Sony Computer Entertainment America at the time, who will become very infamous with Sega later on, by the name of Bernie Stoller.
Not our future. But yeah, I mean, Battle Arena Toshinden, because I didn't even, I'll be honest with you, when these two systems launched, the Saturn and the PlayStation, I couldn't even tell you anything about the PlayStation. I could kind of tell you about something about the Saturn. I was 10. I had no idea what was going on with the PlayStation. I hadn't even heard of it. I thought it was going to be another 3DO thing that was just going to fail, just die overnight. When you saw Battle Arena Toshinden and there was nothing on the Saturn that looked as good as Battle Arena Toshinden, I just want people to understand that. Yeah, it looks like crap today. It plays like crap today. In 1995, that game was the fucking tits.
It was the goddamn truth. It's the first PlayStation game I saw at a kiosk, like a demo kiosk at Blockbuster, and I just sat and watched it. Like, what is? Yeah. It was black magic. I couldn't believe it.
You saw Toshinden, and the other thing is, I can't remember anything else in Sega's library that really came out within the first year.
When did Virtual On come out? That was pretty early, wasn't it?
First, no one remembers Virtual On, and it's a good game, but no one cares about Virtual On.
Yeah, that's like the most forgotten of like the AM2 games.
It's such a good game, but
it is.
You
no
asked
one
if there was
cares about it.
I think that was a good game that was pretty early in the Saturn's lifespan, right?
Oh, Bug. Bug was another one.
Oh,
Bug.
yeah,
But-
Bug.
Anyone remember Bug?
Here's the problem. People wanted the future. And Sony was right, because a lot of the 2D games that I think were coming out in Japan, Sony was like, no, we don't want that in North America, because they were trying to salvage market dominance.
That was Bernie Stoller's whole thing.
He was right. He was fucking right.
He was right until a company called Capcom showed up.
Well, kind of.
Well,
for Sony?
his whole thing was he didn't want 2D games and he didn't want RPGs, which that second one is the big one.
Bernie Stoller's. Are you saying Bernie Stoller was with Sony or Sega at this point?
He still is with Sony. This is what got him fired.
Okay. Because Beyond the Beyond came out pretty early.
That's the first
Yes.
PS1 RPG I got.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so did Wild Arms.
Yes.
I mean, when you think about, but still, when you think about it, what did Sega have? I mean, there's good games that are coming out during this time, like Astal. Astal's a good game.
Astal is a great game.
Very pretty game.
Clockwork Knight.
Clockwork Knight, pre-rendered graphics, but it's like you look
Still
at
a
you
fun
play,
game though.
still a fun game, but it doesn't look that much better than Donkey
True.
Kong Country.
Yeah.
It just
That is
doesn't.
true.
When you're trying to sell people on your console, and you have one company that's putting out games that are three, or most of the games are 3D, and I think Jet
Yes.
Moto came out pretty close to it. And then you had
Jet
like
Moto was early. Twisted Metal was super early.
super early. You had Crash Bandicoot that came out within the first year.
Yep.
You had Western developers that couldn't keep up with Sega, and they got really pissed off. Sega died in North America, like not immediately.
No, it was a couple years in, anyways.
It was by the time the N64 launched in September of '96, and we can talk about the lead up to that. I'll let you do that because I've been talking a lot.
I believe 97 was the year it officially died.
98, because that's when Panzer
90,
Dragoon Saga and Shining Force came out. But like by the end of
That was when Bernie Stoller made the famous quote of "The Saturn is not our future."
Yeah, correct. By the time the N64 came out, the Saturn was dead, because that's when they say buy a Saturn, you get 3 free games. They were putting in
Yes.
Virtua Fighter 2, Virtua Cop, and Daytona USA.
The shit port of Daytona.
It was like by that point, I think it was $200.
Yeah.
So they were doing turbo duo levels of please buy it, please buy it.
I guess to get back to the Bernie Stoller thing before we get to the N64, I believe what got him officially fired was it had to do with Mega Man 8 and Resident Evil 2, I believe. It was like because they were vetoing Mega Man 8 at the time because it was a 2D game. And I believe Capcom threatened that they wouldn't release Resident Evil 2 or something.
I want to hear that story. That's interesting.
I'd have to look into it deeper. I know it had to do with like Capcom was basically like they were trying to veto Mega Man 8, and Capcom like threatened them basically with some of their AAA games because Capcom was kind of on top of the world at that time.
I would love to hear that because like Castlevania Symphony of the Night would also seem like one of those big bumps.
Yeah,
that they just misread because they're like, we don't want 3D games. Like, well, here's Castlevania. Like,
because I believe that was after he got fired because he got fired pretty early because he got fired and then he immediately replaced Tom Kalinske after.
Yeah, and he did a lot of good things for Sega, but we'll get there.
He did, but he also hurt them in the same time. It's confusing.
Yeah,
because he's also partially the reason why a lot of those great 2D Saturn games didn't come out over here.
Yeah, but I mean, the Saturn was also already doomed.
True.
So it's more of like from a selfish perspective.
Yes. Plus the Sonic Extreme fiasco, which is its own nightmare and a half.
Oh yeah, that's something we need to talk about too. Is that the Saturn launch, Sega is known for Sonic.
Mm-hmm.
Where's Sonic?
Where's Sonic?
Where is he?
See, there's a company called Sega Technical Institute, and they're trying their hardest to make a game, and it is not going well.
Again, I understand Sony doesn't have a mascot. I understand Xbox kind of has Master Chief as their mascot, kind of. And Mario will always be with Nintendo. But you look at a lot of the failed systems from Nintendo. And I mean, technically, I would call the N64 a failed console, but it took a while for it to become a failed console. And again, we'll get to that in very soon. But like the GameCube is considered to be a failed console. Didn't launch with a new breakthrough Mario game.
Mm-hmm.
The Wii didn't launch with one, but that's because it had Wii Sports. That's a little bit of an anomaly.
The Wii's, and I think I mentioned this in the last episode, with the exception of an asterisk being the fourth generation of systems.
Yeah.
Every console generation, the most powerful system never wins.
You did mention that, yes.
Gen 4 is weird because technically the Neo Geo was more powerful than the Super Nintendo, but that was not like a novelty system in a sense.
Right. But at this point in time, the industry is mascot driven. By the time it got to the Wii, the industry is no longer mascot driven because the PlayStation 2 had upended the entire system, the entire industry. But like Mario was important. Like, so Nintendo would never launch a system without Mario. Sonic was important. Now, Sega probably thought, well, Sonic didn't launch with the Genesis, so why do we need to launch it with the Saturn? Well, because they were dumb. And they made a lot of dumb decisions.
Also, Sonic Extreme was one of the biggest cases of like development hell in like video game history.
Yeah.
They weren't going to make that launch, like even if the Saturn came out when it was supposed to.
Sega didn't even know what they wanted to do with the Saturn by the time the Saturn launched. I mean, remember that it was supposed to be a 2D powerhouse.
And then they
so they saw Sony, who was inspired by Virtua Fighter, to make a 3D powerhouse that they threw in chips to make it possible to do 3D even to begin with. Yes. So like, even if you got a 3D Sonic game, I mean, Sonic 3D Blast does not count. I'm sorry.
No,
it just doesn't.
That's an upgraded port.
Yeah. And look, the Sonic Jam thing is interesting, but yes, that's a tech demo at best. And that engine they used for the overworld in Sonic Jam would not have made for a great game.
No, so I believe that engine was actually the early phases of Sonic Adventure, but we'll get to that at another point.
But that wouldn't have been a good game. It just would not have been a good game on the Saturn.
To be fair, too, have you actually ever looked at the gameplay footage of what was supposed to be Sonic Extreme?
Yes.
That game doesn't look fun to play. I'm not gonna lie.
No,
it looks like it'd be a pain in the ass.
Like if Sega wanted to do Sonic Adventure, they would have done Crash Bandicoot.
You know the story of Sonic Extreme?
It's Sonic in 3D. But go ahead. I'm sorry.
So the whole concept behind Sonic Extreme was Sonic Team of like Japan. During like the classic era of the series, they were mostly located in America, like Yuji Naka and like all the main people that did Sonic.
Right.
They were working in America with a team called Sega Technical Institute, who were like most famous for games like Comic Zone and The Ooze and Kid Chameleon.
Yeah.
So after the completion of Sonic 3 and Knuckles, they went off. Most of the staff, like the Japanese staff, like Yuji Naka and everyone, went back to Japan and left the remains of Sega Technical Institute in America. Yuji Naka was not interested in making a new Sonic game at the time. He was off to do other things, quote unquote, nights. They left the American branch to basically be like, all right, make the next Sonic game. Good luck. They were basically left on their own. Like it started out as a Genesis game, moved over to the 32X, moved again to the Saturn. Meanwhile, development's been restarted about 7 times by this point. Like it originally was supposed to be like a Sonic 3D Blast looking game. At one point, it was going to be like a stealth game based off of the animated series. Then it was this weird polygon looking thing when it was on the 32X. They never could figure out what they want to do. And then at one point, like Sega brings in a like outside studio to help them develop. That outside studio fucks up the entire project. Sega of Japan is unimpressed. They tell them to restart from scratch, fires half the team, tells the other half of the team, make it this way. They end up making it this way. Half the team is like working like nonstop crunch. 2 of them are dying of like pneumonia and other things. And it just gets to the point where it's like, they have to stop. Someone's going to die.
I mean, Square did it all the time. So
yeah. There's actually a good documentary on YouTube. I forget the name of the channel that made it, but it goes over the entire like development process of Sonic Extreme, and it actually interviews like the developers and stuff. And it was a shit show.
it never came out.
Yep. And the sad part is, I don't even think it would have saved the Saturn because it didn't look like a good game.
I also have to point out, because you said Knights, and this is just me. This is a personal thing. This isn't me just like talking about the history of this shit, because I can't even remember exactly when Knights came out. I knew it was out by the time like the system was dying, because it did.
It was. I remember it being like the last quarter of the lifespan, from my memory.
Yeah,
it was kind of late.
Biggest legacy I think of Knights is introducing analog controllers, or just traditionally analog controllers, to the mainstream market, because it did launch with a 3D pad.
It came out in 96.
96. So I think it came out a little bit before the N64 did. So like this was like, hey, look, it's analog controller with the 3D game. But in my personal opinion, the game sucks. It's shit.
I tried playing it because it's a cult classic. I did not enjoy it.
From what I've noticed with Knights, it's one of those games that you either love it or you hate it, because it has a cool idea.
Yeah.
It's just
it's maybe calling it shit is a little too harsh, but I don't think it lives up to the hype. I think that's a fair assessment.
The hype is pretty ridiculous, because I've honestly, I think half the people hyping it up have never played it, to be perfectly honest.
No, and if they have played it, they haven't gone back to play it.
They only know it for this, the Christmas bonus thing.
Well, I think it was just that the fact that it was pretty cool that you got a new controller with it. And graphically the presentation was really nice, and maybe it was the way it was hyped out at the time, because I remember being hyped about Knights to a certain extent, and I didn't have a Saturn when it was being hyped, and eventually we got Knights and I was really hyped about it. The thing is just that the game is so cryptic, and what it wants you to do.
It's something.
And then when you realize what it wants you to do, you realize it's just an arcade game. It's an arcade game with a console facade. That's all it is. The fact that Sega put so much confidence behind that, when you had bangers like Crash Bandicoot and Super Mario 64 coming out at the same time, yeah, you're going to get slaughtered, dude. Like, you have no hope. It's over. It's done.
Yeah.
And especially because fighting games were finding their way out of fashion as well, and so much was behind Virtua Fighter 2, which, by the way, fantastic port on the Saturn. Absolutely fantastic port, a fantastic game. But fighting games were finding their way out of fashion on consoles. They were still kind of popular in the arcades, to be sure. They still had a decent following, but it wasn't enough to really turn the tide unless you had other things, which is why, Tekken 2 and Tekken were monumental PlayStation games, but they didn't carry the day. But they were reasons that if you were a fighting fan, you would buy that system over the other two.
Yeah. Like, fighting games wouldn't really make a comeback till the next generation.
Kind of. I mean, even kind of. I think like the fighting game, the heyday of the fighting game was the early to mid 90s, and then just kind of.
There's always been a strong vocal, passionate group of fighting game fans, but it's never. I can't think of a time that it was as many more mainstreamed in the 90s.
No.
Yeah.
90s.
Well, I mean, because at this point now, like, gaming's moving on to like the platformer, like the heavy story-based platformers, and of course RPGs.
Yes, and genre-defining games, genre-establishing games. I'll let you introduce the N64 though, because we've been alluding to it, but you can take it.
Okay, so the N64 was originally announced early on as the Ultra 64, and the Ultra 64 was like one of those systems that, like, it was always being talked about, but it was constantly being delayed because it was way ahead of its time for the time, quote unquote. It was the first true 64-bit system, which in hindsight is actually like really redundant because bits don't actually mean that much in the grand scheme of things. But the 64 was kind of like in the background because around this time, Nintendo also released the Virtual Boy, which was rushed out so they could focus development on the 64. During the lead up, one of the most controversial things about the 64 was its continued reliance on cartridges, which was the death nail for the system in a lot of ways. Because the cartridges essentially led to all of their big name developers. Because Nintendo, by this point, a lot of people have to remember, had pretty much video games like on, they had like control, like they had every major developer was backing. Because I mean, even on the Super Nintendo, you had like Capcom, Konami, Hudson Soft,
Squaresoft,
Enix,
Square Enix, before they were one.
Yeah, a ton of different Acclaim for what they were worth.
Acclaim was with everybody though; they didn't give a shit.
True, and even then, they were mostly just a publisher. But
yeah,
Taito. There was a ton. Accolade, like a bunch of developers. A lot of the developers were kind of turned off by the cartridges because limited space, they were way more expensive, and they saw the potential of the PlayStation and the CDs, and a lot of them jumped ship. Most infamously, Squaresoft.
Yes,
which was probably the most, in hindsight, drastic loss they had, because there was that Final Fantasy tech demo thing that was running off.
Do you remember the Ultra 64 tech demo?
Yeah, like a lot of people claim that's a Final Fantasy 7 tech demo. I just think it's a random tech demo they just threw together.
It was a random tech demo
because it had the characters from 6 in it.
Yes, and I think they found, maybe I'm wrong here, but I think Unseen 64, they've unearthed footage of the original concept of what Final Fantasy 6 was supposed to be on the N64, and it looks
you mean 7?
7, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
What Final Fantasy 7 is supposed to be. It looks kind of similar to what like Saga Frontier would be. Not saying it would become Saga Frontier, but it had the same graphical style.
Well, because I believe it actually started on the Super Nintendo too. Like,
wouldn't surprise me.
The earliest like concepts. But Square jumping ship was probably the most infamous of the bunch.
Well, yeah. I mean, this was the era. So the N64, like, it comes out in 96, and it comes out to, I mean, it was being hyped up with Killer Instinct in the arcades.
Mario 64 was the big one.
Mario 64 was the big driving game to get people out there, and it was worth it. But like prior to the N64 coming out, you had the arcade presence of like Cruis'n USA and Killer Instinct that you were being told this was the game. These were the games that were going to be on your N64 hardware.
And then Killer Instinct didn't even end up coming out on it initially. It ended up becoming a Super Nintendo game.
And then KI Gold, which is essentially a port of Killer Instinct 2, wasn't even as defined as the original Killer Instinct.
It was like a mediocre port at best.
Well, yeah, because it wasn't running on the same hardware. It was kind of a bait and switch to an extent. It lands, and even though it has 2 games in North America, and I don't know what it was in Japan, but I know in North America you had Mario 64 and Pilot Wing 64.
I think it was the same. I think Japan had one other game, and it was like this weird, obscure thing that no one remembers.
Right. And so people are buying the shit out of the N64 because they're excited for it. It's Nintendo. They're buying it up. Mario 64 is a fantastic game. Just utterly classic game.
Yeah. The hardcore Nintendo fans flock to it, like, because Nintendo fans are Nintendo fans. They'll never stray.
Right. The Nintendo cult, baby.
And Sony didn't really have a marquee game at the time. They didn't have a game that everyone wanted to buy. Yeah, I mean, Sony did a really good job of marketing towards like teenagers with games like Toshinden and Wipeout. Mm-hmm. But for the most part, your key demographic was still the Nintendo age people. But what was turning the tide, I still think what's one of the most underrated games in terms of turning the tide against Nintendo is Resident Evil.
Oh, yeah.
Not just because it's mature content, because that is one of the biggest reasons, is now because you have people who've been playing Nintendo since the mid 80s, and now it's like 1996, and people are older and they want more mature content. Mm-hmm. And that's what Resident Evil is delivering. They're giving you something that is like what a 17, 18-year-old would want. It's why so many people flocked away from Nintendo with Sega, with the Genesis. So now that demographic because the Saturn's too expensive. It has games that they're not in love with the arcades. Had finally figured out a way to full motion video and place it in games effectively. Not it wasn't new, like the Sega CD. You had all those like Marky Mark fucking like make your own videos.
FMV games, whatever.
Exactly.
Double Switch.
You had a lot of FMV games. Yes. You had tons of FMV games.
Tomcat Alley,
Sewer Shark,
Ground Zero Texas.
Yeah. But they sucked. But you got to a point where they were starting to integrate voice acting and full motion video, and they were doing it effectively and they were doing it well. And the N64 couldn't do that.
No.
It just could not do that. And Final Fantasy VII drove that point home.
Now, before we get to 7, because that's a huge part of this era, the N64, I guess, talking about it from a technical standpoint, the N64 is like one of the dumbest design consoles probably ever made. The system had a severe like bottlenecking issue because of how the cartridges were like, it had this incredibly like, honestly, the hardware was too powerful for what the system was capable of. And it would bottleneck at times. So you'd have like frame rate issues or clipping, or like polygons would look weird, or you sacrifice sound. And some companies designed ways to get around this, particularly Rare. Rare was probably the kings of getting around that. Even some of their games run kind of jank.
Conquerors doesn't play as well as people think.
No, Banjo-Tooie runs like shit if you actually play it nowadays. And then another company that were very well known for working around it was Factor 5 with the Star Wars.
They're fantastic.
Knights of the Republic.
Yeah, no, not Knights of the Republic. Rogue Squadron.
Rogue Squadron. Yeah, and Battle of Naboo. That was the other one.
Yeah,
because they actually had there was actually special codes programmed into the N64 that Nintendo, because this is Nintendo's other stupid thing. They wouldn't share this special code with any other developers. Only their first and second party studios. So Rare knew about it, but they wouldn't share with anyone else. Factor 5 made their own, which was actually better than Nintendo's.
You know, that's a funny story that you say, because when we did our episode on Crash Bandicoot for Retro Hangover, one of the, and this isn't a secret, I mean, you can find this anywhere, is that one of the reasons that Naughty Dog went to Sony is because they tried calling Nintendo up and Nintendo wouldn't return their phone calls. Just because they were a Western developer. They didn't want to talk to them. And so like Nintendo, again, they thought they were King Dick because they just barely beat Sega without realizing that the Super Nintendo sold less than the NES. Like, okay, like you lost market share, but you still like, oh, well, we have victory and people are just going to buy us because Sega's just has completely crippled themselves with stupid decision making. And Sony is a newcomer. They're not going to beat us, but they obviously did. So that's what it came down to, is Nintendo still had this policy where they were infallible and everything they did was the right decision. And we speak of it now, like you look back at it now and it's so easy. It's so easy to say like they were dumb for going with CD technology. People need to realize that when we say CD technology in 1994, 1995, when these systems came out, it was 2x read speed, which was fucking pathetic. And loading times were a real concern. They were really a thing. If you don't believe me, go get an original PlayStation and put Street Fighter Alpha on that motherfucker. You're going to be pissed.
Yep.
You're going to hate
Fighter
life.
Alpha on PlayStation. You just you got used to it, but it sucked.
That's why I have such an appreciation for companies like Namco who let us play freaking Galaxian during the loading screens.
Yeah.
But that's only because like they figured out a way to put Olive Ridge Racer into the cache.
Yes.
You can't do that with Street Fighter Alpha. You can't
That's
do that
fair.
with every game. That's why you could take a music CD and you can put that in. And because like Ridge Racer is only one track anyway, that's why I think Ridge Racer is a complete shit show of a game, but it worked for the time. It worked for the time. But yeah, loading times were a real concern.
Yeah.
They were a real concern.
Yeah. And it took towards the end of the generation for developers to really figure out ways around that. Like one of the games that always comes to mind is like one of the technical marvels of that generation is Legacy of Kain Soul Reaver.
Woo!
Like that game has like no load times at all.
And
Granted, there's a lot of very long hallways.
There's some long hallways. You shift the. I remember reading a technical like interview around the development of that game, and I don't remember the details, but the ability to shift dimensions into like the spirit world and the physical world, that almost broke the game, and they almost scrapped the whole game trying to get that to work.
Oh, wow.
From what I remember, yeah.
It's ironic though, because that's not even the best version of the game.
The Dreamcast version is awesome. I've been playing that version on emulator, and it's the shit.
We'll get the Dreamcast later, though.
It shouldn't be understated that Resident Evil didn't have a lot of load times.
No, it didn't. Resident Evil was
no.
very well designed.
It was the 3D games did not have a lot of load times outside of like fighting games. Fighting games had a lot of load time.
Yeah.
And that's why I'm saying like fighting games were still, they were going out of fashion. They weren't quite out of fashion yet, but they were going out of fashion.
The problem with fighting games is there really isn't any time to load stuff in the background while other things are happening, which is one of the reasons why it was so apparent. Like in Resident Evil, they disguised them cleverly with like the door opening of the stairs.
Yeah.
Which was immersive and it got you into the like experience.
But then you have games like Crash Bandicoot. And there are loading times, but they're not atrocious.
No.
They're not horrible. You can get past it. It was still a concern because there are no loading times in Mario 64.
That is true.
There's none. So any little bit of loading time is frustrating to an 11-year-old, especially someone who had like ADHD, probably like myself.
Like even Final Fantasy VII. There's that
no loading times. No, I mean no noticeable loading times. There were loading times, of course, right?
There's that little stutter when like a battle happens occasionally.
Yeah, or like how it loads up the battle, like you
swirls the screen,
the flash. Yeah. And then like you get the flash and it rotates and then it like loads everything as it's displaying the background. But you're not really thinking it loading times. You're like, oh, this is cool.
Yeah.
Because same with like Symphony of the Night too. Like you don't notice the loading times because it's in a transitional room between two different areas.
The CD rooms.
Yeah.
Which they kept in the Game Boy Advance version, hilariously enough.
Which you don't really think about until it's pointed out. You're like, oh, okay, cool. So loading times went away. I mean, they didn't go away. There were still loading times.
No. Well, I think that gamers adapted to a degree as well.
Yeah.
Yes.
But I guess we should probably talk a bit about 7, just because 7 is one of the most important games of this generation.
I would think it's the most important.
It is the most.
Generation.
I always say it's that, Metal Gear, and Castlevania. They're like Castlevania, maybe less. Metal Gear is definitely up there.
If we're talking about importance, I'm not going to rank these in any specific order. I do think Final Fantasy VII is the most important. I'm not saying it's the best. I'm saying it's the most important.
Yes, when you say most important, you mean like impactful to the industry and the culture. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Final Fantasy VII is the most important. Number 2 is Gran Turismo. Number 3 is Resident Evil.
I'd argue Metal Gear has a
You would say Gran
point.
Turismo over Metal Gear?
In a heartbeat.
Influence?
Oh, look at the sales, dude. Gran Turismo 2 is the best-selling game in the system.
It's also one of the best-looking games on the system.
It is true.
Too.
Yes, it is.
Polyphony Digital is nuts.
But Gran Turismo, Final Fantasy VII, that's why I say it's the most important. It really cemented Sony as the dominant tour de force of that generation.
It also broke RPGs into the mainstream, which is the other.
Well, yes. Majority of the sales for Final Fantasy VII were in Japan.
That's true.
Gran Turismo dominated every market.
That's true.
That's a good point.
You also have the key, remember, though, is Gran Turismo came out in the 90s, and that was still when we had a big car culture.
Yes.
Because nowadays, I don't think Gran Turismo would do nearly as well nowadays if it was a new concept.
Well, no, but it was also an RPG.
Gran Turismo?
Tell me it's not.
Yeah, it is. It's got RPG mechanics.
Management simulator. Yeah, I give you that.
You drive a race, you get money, aka experience points, and you apply those experience points towards car parts.
Yeah, RPG is weird because when I think RPG, I think like what most people would assume. Management simulation. Yeah, I mean it's true technically.
And it's deep. It's a deep game. It has It has very relevant, pertinent things that are that you can relate to society. That things that you did every day. Yeah, Gran Turismo is probably the second most important game on the PlayStation.
I would argue, though. So sales wise, it's obviously the numbers are the numbers. But as far as influencing and changing the industry, I feel like Metal Gear changed the paradigm more than
Gran
Turismo did.
Long term, not immediate. I would not say immediate. Gran Turismo changed it immediately.
True.
Final Fantasy VII changed it immediately. Resident Evil changed it immediately.
True.
It took a while for Metal Gear.
I'd say Metal Gear changed storytelling in games.
I don't think it changed storytelling in the way that Half-Life did.
Fair. It's hard to say because I didn't grow up with Half-Life.
Half-Life came out in 98. Same year as Metal Gear Solid. You're going to tell me that Metal Gear Solid had more of an impact than Half-Life in the industry? No, absolutely not. Metal Gear had its place. Metal Gear is fantastic, and I will play Metal Gear over Half-Life any day of the fucking week.
Okay.
However, if you want to talk about storytelling and gaming, it's Half-Life.
Okay.
I think for me, Metal Gear was the first time I saw like cinematography in cutscenes in 3D.
How is that different than what happened in Resident Evil? Like Resident Evil laid the groundwork for it, though.
My thing with Resident Evil is, I guess I want to take away like recency bias towards it, because
Sure.
Resident Evil in hindsight is, I guess I take a lot of like my problems with Resident Evil is like how like bad the actual like localization is.
It has got some.
No, it's not even localization. They didn't change anything.
Well, what I mean is like how bad the actual like acting and like presentation is in,
You're
in a lot
almost
of
a
ways.
Jill sandwich. It's like,
Yeah, I like Jill sandwiches.
Well, it's funny in hindsight. I'm just saying like
I just don't want them to touch. You know what I'm saying?
I get no, because I get what you're saying, because what you're saying makes a lot of sense. I guess it's more like the standards changed with Metal Gear, because voice acting was still pretty cringe. Like
yeah,
around the
Resident
time.
Evil is nothing like Metal Gear fucks Resident Evil up.
In terms of
Yeah.
voice acting. and
Resident Evil was
presentation.
first. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I'm not.
Like-
I'm not saying Metal Gear was the first to do cinematography, but it was the first time a game was like, oh shit, we're on a new level now. Like it's different now. At least for me, that's my subjective experience seeing.
That's
Metal
kind of
Gear.
my way. I think it's because like I think time is just tainted. You know what it also is? Because Resident Evil got like one of the greatest remakes of all time.
The GameCube remake.
No, because I remember Resident Evil being the really driving force for me to get a PlayStation. Because it did things differently. It did have voice acting. It did have cutscenes. It like real time cutscenes, not like live act. It did have that too, but like not only at the beginning and the end, which you
There's
have
no
no
full
yourself.
3D cinematography in Resident Evil. It's either CGI cutscenes or pre-rendered backgrounds.
There are no CGI cutscenes in Resident Evil.
It's so there's no full 3D
Yeah,
environments.
when the zombie reveals himself at the very beginning, turns his head. That's CGI.
Oh,
What do you smell?
Okay,
dude?
that's like the only one.
That's like one of like maybe
Not the only one, but there's not a lot. No, there are CG ones. I'm sorry. I'm misremembering a lot. You're correct.
I'm gonna like put this. I think the difference is I have a different viewpoint because I was like I didn't experience the PlayStation at launch. I was like
You came back to it. Yeah.
when I was cognizant enough to know what video games were, it was already like kind of the dominant force it was, which was right towards the end of its life.
This is the thing with Metal Gear Solid, though. It was influential on an industry level. I know it's a big time seller, but it didn't sell as much as Harry Potter. Okay, so let's get something straight. Metal Gear Solid is very influential on how people did something. It is true.
You're talking about the book, right?
Yeah, the game.
Harry
really?
Potter the game sold more than Metal Gear Solid.
Yes, on the PlayStation. Yes.
Motherfucker, I hate when you're right. You son of a bitch. He is right,
That's
dude.
sad. That game is so.
I just played the Philosopher's Stone for a video, and it sucked.
The graphics are so hilarious.
They are pretty funny.
This is what I'm saying in terms of influence, man. Look,
I know.
It's delayed. It's more delayed than I remember. Yeah.
as hardcore gamers that we are, we tend to be playing games more on the cutting edge that are probably more cult oriented than many other players do. If I asked you what the best what's the best selling Castlevania game of all time, Cade? What do you think it is?
Second best or best?
The best. First, give me the best.
Best Castlevania selling game of all time.
Yes.
The Game Boy Advanced one?
No.
Is it Symphony of the Night?
No.
No.
Okay.
No, it's not, because he's tricking me. I knew it wouldn't be Symphony.
It's not a trick. It's a
Not
question.
tricky. It's gonna be something I wouldn't.
So the best selling game is Lords of Shadow.
Is it really?
That actually makes sense.
You know what the second best one is? I might be wrong, and this might be third because of Lords of Shadow 2. I hope not. You know what the second best selling Castlevania is?
Which one?
Castlevania.
Is it really?
So when we say these games are super important, when we say they're oriented around our tastes, because we are the hardcore gamers that love extremely tight and solid gaming experiences. And so we hold a lot of these games from our own childhood in terms of nostalgia up on a
True.
pedestal.
Damn, he's right.
When we get to the PlayStation era and everyone's like, yeah, Metal Gear Solid was the most influential game of the time and everyone loved it. Yeah, we loved it. But guess what? A lot of other people didn't, and they'd rather play Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone. A lot of people wanted to play Gran Turismo.
That's a fair point.
Yeah. A lot more people wanted to play Resident Evil. So you want to talk about what's driving sales, what's driving the market immediately, and what's changing things immediately in terms of everything? It's those games. Metal Gear Solid is a culmination of essentially Resident Evil and Police Knots. And that's where that went. But they saw the influence and developers said, hey, maybe we can do something more with this medium. And that does lead to what you got later with like Shadow of the Colossus, which also didn't sell a ton of games for the PS2 when you compare it to
really didn't.
God of War. But what's a better game, in my opinion? Shadow of the Colossus, hands down. But guess what? Everyone, every single podcast you go on, every single YouTube video you watch is going to tell you that Shadow of the Colossus was a beloved game. They're also going to say God of War was a beloved game, but they're going to hype up Shadow of the Colossus more. But guess which game, in your average gamer's perspective, is going to be the better game? God of War.
God of War. Yeah. Yeah, that's true. It's mostly just because I didn't grow up with it. I think because when I was around, Metal Gear was like the top of the town.
Yeah, Metal Gear just blew my mind as a kid. So
same. Yeah. I 100% agree with you. Metal Gear changed my entire outlook of what a video game could be because I played it.
True. I think a lot of it has to do too is like when I think like defining Resident Evils, the first one isn't the one that comes to mind. I always think of 2.
No, it's fair. It's entirely fair. And a lot of people would agree with you because 2 sold way more than 1 did.
Yeah, way more.
And it's debatably a better game.
I know it's definitely a better game.
So I'd say the best survival horror game in the series is the GameCube remake of 1, just in terms of a horror like perspective of the classic ones.
Yeah, I would need to play the most recent remakes, but it's hard to disagree with you.
The new Resident Evil 2 remake is pretty damn good.
See, my thing is it's borderline a different game at this point. It's just a new game that is based off of the 2.
Dude, the first Resident Evil, I remember not being able to play it because of the ESRB and watching other kids play it and seeing zombies get their heads blown off and being so jealous that I couldn't. I could only play it at friends' houses.
Fucking ESRB.
Believe it, my first experience with the original Resident Evil was the DS port.
I didn't even know there was a DS port of Resident Evil.
It's called Deadly Silence. It's a really solid port. Like it's identical, but it's on the DS. It's also one of like the sick 12 M-rated DS games. I was really curious, so I looked up the best-selling PlayStation games. It's actually really funny. It's Gran Turismo, Final Fantasy 7, Gran Turismo 2, Final Fantasy 8, Tekken 3, Harry Potter.
Fucking Harry Potter, dude.
Then Crash 2, Crash 3, Tomb Raider, Metal Gear's 10. That shocked me.
It's an important game. I mean, there's no doubting it's an important game, but it's not the most important game.
It's fair in hindsight.
It obviously, I didn't realize that it was that low. I mean, I knew it was going to be a bestseller. I would have thought it was like 7 or 6, not 10.
Yeah.
But I would still argue that its influenced gaming more than Gran Turismo did. Because Gran Turismo is just a racing game. It influenced other racing games. Metal Gear influenced all gaming.
I will give Chris a bit on the Gran Turismo because Gran Turismo changed the scope of like racers.
Of racers, a subgenre that no one plays anymore. Not even, Forza
it's changed
Horizon,
the scope of sports games. How deep was Madden before Gran Turismo?
I don't know.
Yeah,
I didn't play a lot of Madden.
I'm not a football guy.
You may have had, I don't know if you had franchise mode before Gran Turismo. I'm not saying it was directly influenced, but when you get into like, you have a racing game where you can micromanage the shit out of every single part on your fucking car. And the best-selling games in today's world are first-person shooters and Madden
and open world games.
I kind of look at it and you could say, yes, like Metal Gear Solid is the most influential game for the games we play.
That's fair. Like
the way I put it is it's very influential in how it presented games, in my opinion.
Yes, but I think Half-Life did a better job, especially when you look at where the industry has gone. Half-Life did a better job, and they came out the same year.
See, that's like the Western philosophy versus like the Japanese philosophy because they're very different, but they're similar at the same time.
Yeah, and I think if you want to go like industry-wide, in terms of what sells more, Half-Life by far just absolutely crushed Metal Gear Solid by far. Halo, Call of Duty, and Battlefield I mean, mostly Halo now, because Battlefield and Call of Duty have found a way to fuck themselves into oblivion. But like for the past 20 years, it's Half-Life. Half-Life did it.
I will agree.
Yeah.
Cade, me and you were in that really small minority where we're just kind of psychotic Metal Gear fans.
I'm not disagreeing with you in terms of how much I love the game. I'm just saying, like, just step back.
I am stepping back, and I even see your argument. Okay, so Gran Turismo, maybe if you're being nice, influenced all sports games to be deeper.
So when it comes to sports games, I just want to point this out. When I think of like a quote unquote simulation racing game before Gran Turismo, I think of stuff like this.
I don't even what NASCAR game is that? What's that?
It's on the NES.
For the NES, yeah.
It's sealed and never opened.
Is it an NES NASCAR game?
You know, Final Lap Twin too, TurboGrafx and
See,
those kind of games.
I love this just because you can win a trip to the 1992 Daytona 500.
Ooh,
the voucher's still in. The voucher's still in there.
I have never seen this game.
It's not good. It's not.
It looks
good.
like. Remember that old PC game called like Test Track or something?
Test Drive.
Test Drive. Looks a little like that, just shittier.
But like you're making an argument against Gran Turismo. This is almost just becoming a. If you're still, I mean, we are still recording. This is becoming a PlayStation episode, which I'm absolutely fine with.
So it's like a Gen 5 in general, because Gen 5 is this big.
Yeah, and we're I guess going to end up talking about the N64 and PlayStation. Probably PlayStation. It's fitting because it dominated. But you look at Gran Turismo. It not just redefined what people thought about sports games, because it didn't technically sports games. It didn't immediately reach out to sports games. But what it did do is it took a lot of the experiences that people compartmentalized on arcade games and realized that arcade games, I mean, it was already going that direction, but this was for certain. Our games that you usually associated with the arcade experience could be way more than an arcade experience.
So it was also kind of like an escape for like, not everybody can own like a Corvette or a Lamborghini. That was the thing about Gran Turismo. You could experience all of these cars, like, and they played pretty realistically for the time. I mean, obviously, it's gotten better in the long run.
And Gran Turismo didn't have analog control, if I remember correctly. The first one did not.
The first one, well, I think it added support later, right?
It might have added it.
I think it added support later.
The second definitely. The second 7 definitely had it.
Yeah.
The second one. I think it might have been like a Resident Evil situation where they later added it.
Maybe the first one did, because the first one came out after Omega Boost.
Yes, Omega Boost was before. Yeah.
And Omega Boost had analog.
Yeah. That was Polyphony's only non-racing game.
And I've played Omega Boost on emulator with the emulating the analog controller on PlayStation, and it worked. So if Omega Boost had analog support, then I would think that Gran Turismo did.
Yeah.
Omega Boost is kind of an anomaly though, because that was actually made by former members of Team Andromeda, the Panzer Dragoon series.
Was it?
Yeah.
I thought Polyphony was Western.
No, that's one of the like 2 Japanese studios they have.
Polyphony, yeah. I didn't know. I thought all of Team Andromeda went on to Smile a bit to make Jet Set Radio Future or Phantasy Star Online.
A lot of them did.
Yeah.
A good amount of them went on to some of the key people went on to Polyphony.
Smile Bit. Oh wow. Okay, I didn't know that. I did not. That's new. That's awesome.
It wasn't like a large portion of the team, but it was like some of the key members.
So out of the people who didn't die making Panzer Dragoon Saga, they either went to make Smile Bit, Phantasy Star Online, or Polyphony.
Yeah, Gran Turismo.
Omega Boost is one of those games I didn't even know about till like 6 months ago.
No, it's wicked obscure.
It's really cool though.
That's one of those ones that I post on my blog, and it always is a dud because nobody knows about it.
You know how I found out about it? I found out about it a long time ago, and the reason I did was because of Classic Game Room.
I miss Classic Game Room. Damn, that's nostalgic because I fucking loved watching those.
Now, if Mark would return our fucking messages, you coward, we can interview you too.
Last time I heard from Mark, he was on Pat Contry's podcast like years ago.
He has his own podcast now.
Does he?
Yeah, and he's also coming out with he's doing the narration for a documentary on Toplan.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Which is if you like shmups, watch the channel Shmup Junkie. I'm a patron of them. They're fantastic. He is fantastic. He's doing a collaboration with someone who lives in Japan, a friend of his, and they're doing a documentary on Toaplan. They got a bunch of the original people from Toaplan, and they got Mark Bussler to do the narration for the documentary. So good for them.
Nice.
That sounds cool. Is there anything left in this generation, obscure facts that you guys can?
Oh my God. Yeah, we're talking about video games.
Oh, right. Yeah. So we were talking about Final Fantasy VII.
We could probably have another episode just talking about this generation because we haven't even talked about the N64, have we?
Yeah, we're
Barely.
gonna have to do another episode. It's fine though. Instead of releasing these back to back, I'm just gonna release them until we go through the whole thing, and I'll just release.
That might be for the better.
Yeah.
Do us a solid, Kate, and just remind us what you want us to talk about. And
Well,
where we left off on.
did. I came to this thinking we were starting with PS2, and you guys both had different memories. So
No, that's the
I'm
thing.
a pothead.
Like,
I don't trust my memory.
you don't need memory, dude. You need facts. This is your show. This is your shit.
You know what?
This
You're
is
right.
not our shit.
I should have listened to the episode. I just went off my memory, and I'm like, I thought we finished PlayStation 64.
No, because
and all
we
that.
stopped instinctively because we knew this was going to be a long one.
Yes.
Yeah.
Or we had been going for 3 hours when we stopped last time, like 3.5 hours.
Yeah.
We were like, this is too long. Like we're about to get right now that you're saying, hey, it's too long. Like, okay. So what you just got to do is you got to be like, okay, this is where we left off. So do you guys want to talk about the N64 and the Saturn? We're going to say yes, because we probably love these systems.
We've already talked about the Saturn, so maybe
We kind of did. We didn't talk about the death of the Saturn, but we kind of did too.
well, then we're
Yeah.
gonna have to split this generation.
We didn't
into
talk about the
another
N64.
episode.
We didn't really talk about the N64 or
No.
like the
Dude, we didn't
massive
even talk
amount.
about the PlayStation, which
I
is my
know.
favorite shit.
We
Well,
were
'cause the-
talking about the most revolutionary games on the PlayStation. That's where we left off before we went on break. Exclusively
bit.
for the PlayStation.
you
And
guys-
you argued
you guys-
with me about
first
Metal Gear
off-
Solid.
First off,
did.
you guys
We did.
You guys went back in time for the first half an hour to the old generation.
Because
And
of you. Because you didn't know where we were.
Well, I mean, Kate, your show is called Gaming Memories.
It's true.
Yeah, we're remembering.
It's true.